All right, so let's take a look inside Blender to actually see where all the settings are that affect your camera. So here I am inside the default scene, and the first thing I want to show you is the output resolution for your camera. So here I've got my camera selected, and you might think that you need to select this camera to say, if you wanted to output a 1920 by 1080 resolution, you might be thinking that it's actually part of the camera settings here, but it's not. It's actually tied to the scene output, which is this little printer icon here. So if we change this, you'll see the size of our camera is actually moving here. I'm just going to split my window here. So drag this up. Let's make this a 3D viewport. And I'm going to press the numpad 0 to view through our camera here. Or you could just push this little icon here and it will do exactly the same thing. So if we change this, you can actually see that it is changing the resolution here. But let me just reset that back to default, which is 1920 by 1080. So now this is the default resolution. Now almost everything else to do with the camera is inside the data tab here, which is the green camera icon. Right, now before we jump into the focal lengths and the types of camera, I want to point out that there's a difference between the actual viewport, like how you see the view, and the camera actual focal length, and there's that settings. So I'm going to bring up my panel here. I'll turn on my screencast key so you can see it as well. And inside the view tab, I'll just drag this down so you can see that says view there. You'll see we've actually got the focal length and the clip start and end for our viewport. Now this works exactly the same way as our camera, but it's actually the vantage point that we're looking at our scene from. So if we wanted to zoom in our scene, we would do this. And if we wanted to zoom out, we do this. But bear in mind, the same perspective distortion happens. So say if let's lower this down to a 12mm lens and we go zoom in here. So we've got the same perspective distortion as we had in the previous video. So I wouldn't suggest doing this. I would just leave this at the default 50mm. So you can see it's looking much more natural. And remember, 50mm is equivalent to the human eye. So this is pretty close to how we actually see things. By the way, this is all viewport specific. So if we jump down to this one here, we can go to this viewport and change this one to be 30mm, and it doesn't affect any of the other ones up here. Okay, so let's jump back to our camera view. I'll hit this button here. The clipping start is how close to the camera before things start showing. So if we drag this up, you'll see our cube disappears because it is that is 6 meters from the camera. But let's just undo that. I think it is 0.1, which is 10 centimeters. I actually think that's a little bit too far away. So let's just make it 1 centimeter away. And then it can see 1 kilometer or 1,000 meters into the distance. If we drag this down, I'll just type something in here. Let's make this 10 meters. You'll see, okay, we can't see it. Let's drag it up now. You can see, okay, that is the extent to which we can see. Okay, so that is actually the viewport. Now the same settings for the camera is down here. We've got our clipping start and our clipping end. I don't need to show you that. Although I think the default of 100 meters for the camera is a little bit short. So you might want to start with the default of say 1,000 meters, which is 1 kilometer. That way, if you're dealing with a large scene, you're not going to have it cut off. And you're wondering why you can't see your rolling hills in the background. All right, so let's actually adjust our focal length here, and you can see it's adjusting the way that it displays in our viewport, and it's changing the way we see from our camera vantage point. So that is how we set our zoom here. And if we actually wanted to do our tilt shift, that's what this shift X and Y is. So if we grab our X and drag it here, that is our shift. And then our Y is actually the tilt, where we're going up and down. It's keeping the lens parallel to the sensor, but it's changing the perspective point. So let's just return these back to 0. Okay, so it's actually 3 types of camera inside Blender. There is the perspective camera that we have been looking at. There is the orthographic, which looks a little bit different. And the difference with that is we don't actually have any perspective at all. You can see our cube here is looking very flat. And let's just actually duplicate this cube and move it further away. And if I position our camera here to look around, you see this one in the distance, oops a daisy, this one in the distance isn't smaller because it doesn't have any perspective. But if we change this back to perspective, you'll see now it is smaller because it is further away. That is the difference between the orthographic and the perspective. It's the same thing as when you change our view here from being orthographic or perspective by hitting this little icon here or hitting 5 on the numpad. Okay, so the way that you adjust the scale of our orthographic camera is this setting here. So we've just got a scale, and you can see what it's doing here. It's just making that bigger or smaller. And once again, the thing that is further in the background is actually the same physical size. There is no perspective at all. So let me just show you one more thing about this. If we actually get closer, it's not changing the perspective at all. But if we go past that object, it will disappear based on our clipping setting, as we've already learnt. Now the other camera, I won't be going over in great detail. That is the panoramic view. Now let me just set up something quite quickly. I'm just going to grab one here and duplicate it. Let's make this a really wide perspective. You can see what that's done to our view here. Now it's worth pointing out that the viewport doesn't display correctly for the actual render. And when you want to use a panoramic camera, the only engine that will work with it is Cycles engine. So if we go over to our render settings here, the render engine is set to Eevee. A panoramic camera will not work. We have to jump over to the Cycles. And remember, this viewport, it can't really display the panoramic view. So we have to actually render it. So let's just go viewport render image. So you can see this render here is actually how it should look, where the viewport can't physically display this. All right, so let's return things back to normal by going back to our perspective view. Now the lens unit here, you can actually decide to show it in the angle of view. That is like how much it can see, like how wide. And this is a very difficult way of thinking about it in my view, except if you are needing to do a panoramic view, then actually just setting it, I want it to be 173, which happens to be the maximum. That is how much we're going to see. So that is all the way out here to here. That is your field of view. And excuse the writing, I was drawing with my mouse. All right, so moving on from all the lens settings, we're going to go into the depth of field. Now this can be a little bit tricky to turn on. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we enable it for our camera. I'm in the camera data here. And we also then need to, if you want to see it in the viewport, you need to enable it for the viewport. Now you need to be in the shading mode first, and then bring up our little menu here and go down to here, and you see depth of field. So now you can see we've got some blur going on, and that's now also active in the other mode. So in material preview as well as the rendered mode, it does not blur when you're in wireframe, but that would be a really weird thing if it did. So now I can actually see my blur, but it's difficult to actually tell what's going on in my viewport unless you enable the few of the viewport display settings. We're going to go down in our tab here to viewport display. I'm going to turn on my limits here, and now you can see, aha, we've got this little widget here that tells me where my focal plane is going to be. As you've learned, we can actually set that value in a few different ways. We can actually animate this and then make change it to be, okay, our focal plane is there, or we can set it to be an object. So I'm just going to click the eyedropper here and just click this cube here, and then you'll see one of those cubes, whichever one that I've selected, I think it was that one, is going to be the point of focus. Let me just undo that and then talk about our f-stop. So I'm going to bring this here so you can see we've got a nice focal point of being our lady here. Let me bring up our... Okay, so the f-stop, as you've learned, controls how much in focus or not. Now this is a little bit easier to see. I've got this little add-on which I've found online. I will include the link for this in the description for the video, but bear in mind this isn't maintained by me, it's maintained by someone else, so you don't actually need this. It just helps visualize what's going on. So here we've got the start of the point that is perfectly in focus and the end of the point that is reasonably in focus. So that's my area of interest. So we can change the focal point here. Oh, sorry, not that one. The focal distance. That's what the f-stop does. It's also worth pointing out that the more blur that you have displaying in your scene, the slower it is going to go. Now the blades, the rotation, and the ratio are all going to affect the way that it blurs. Now the way something blurs is referred to as the bokeh, which is a Japanese word meaning the way things blur. There's two ways of pronouncing it in Japanese. Now I'm not an expert, but there is bokeh, where it goes up at the end, and there is bokeh, where it goes down at the end. But in the West, we butcher that word and we say it however we want. So often you hear it pronounced as bokeh or bok or bokkers or even Steve. That's a lie, I just made that one up. So don't worry about the word, it just means the way stuff blurs. And the blades, the rotation, and the ratio affect the shape of that bokeh or bokkers, if you will. So remember our iris, how it had the blades on it? This is going to simulate how many blades that it has. And the more it has, the more circular it becomes. It just affects the shape. And the rotation is going to spin it clockwise around that. And the ratio, I'm not going to pretend I know what it does, but the little description here says it gives you the anamorphic lens bokeh distortion. I just said bokeh and I should have said bokehs, but you know what I mean. That's what all these settings do. But I'm going to hazard a guess and say you're probably going to leave those at the default. So I'm going to disable that depth of field, and then we're going to move on to our camera settings. So the camera settings, this is the size of your sensor. So as we've learnt, you only need to adjust the sensor if you are needing to emulate a specific type of camera. So by that I mean, if you click in our menu here, this is an iPhone 4 or an iPhone 4S or a red one. This is only useful if you're trying to match some footage or something like that. If you're not trying to do anything of that sort, just leave it at Auto 36, which is a default setting. And as you've already learned, it is based on the actual digital SLR cameras, and before that, the actual analog version of the film cameras. But if we adjust this, it's kind of like we're adjusting our zoom. And technically you're not, but you can think about it as that's really what it's doing. Let's just leave that at the default 36 because it's a scary thing to play with. All right, let's turn on our safe areas. Now, by default, you can't really see these little lines here. Let me just change our view. Jump over here and let's change our viewport, make it a little lighter. And you can see these dotted lines. So these are our safe margins, and you can set these here. This is for titles and action safe. You want to keep things visible in your viewport to make sure that older televisions and whatnot can actually see them. Chances are you probably won't need them in today's digital age unless you're doing something for television broadcast or something of that effect. That's what these settings are here. And you've also got some alternate ones here, which is the center title ones. But let me just turn them off, clean up our view. Now let's get stuck into the viewport display. So we can actually display how big this icon is here with this little handy slider. We can change the size up, but don't go too big because then it's a little bit cumbersome and gets in your way. And you can decide whether you want to turn your limits on, the mist, so you can see the start and the end of the mist. If you're doing some compositing, the mist pass can be very handy. This is going to show your sensor size. You can see it here very faintly around our around our viewport here. But you probably don't need that one. Now the name just shows you when you're looking through the camera, you can see what camera you're looking for, which is sometimes very handy. And also we have our composition guides. So one thing that you might use quite often would be the rule of thirds, which would be this one here. So you click this one on and you can see it's divided into 9 squares, which gives you these lines here, which will help you compose your frame. I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a later video. And finally, we have the passepartout, which means matte. It's a French word, which explains exactly why I just butchered the word. This is the color on the outside of your view here. So if we turn it off, you'll see we don't see any color. If we turn it on, we can then control the opacity. Now I find it's pretty handy to have this at say 50%, but then when you're getting down to the final details, turning this up really does help block out any action that's off screen, because that can actually trick your mind and thinking that it's actually on the screen when it's not. So that's a very handy thing to adjust when you're in the final stages of animation. So what if you have multiple cameras in your scene? How do you tell Blender which camera that you want to actually render from? Well, there's a few ways to do that. As with many things in Blender, there's always many different ways. If we go over to the scene settings over here, the one that looks like the 3 objects, you've got your camera up here. And you can choose whatever camera that you want. Camera 1, camera 2, camera 3. And if we choose that, you'll see that this one is now filled in, and this one is the active camera. And you can see that is respected up here because we can see our blue ball here. Although while I'm here, let's just turn that onto object. We get our colors. It makes it a little bit easier to see. So another way of doing that is, say if I want this one to be active, I can just hit Control numpad 0, and that will jump to the view and it will also make it active. We can do the same thing from the menu up here. If we go, I'll just choose this one here and go View. We go to Camera, we can jump to the active camera with the numpad 0, or we can set the active object as the camera. So there we go. Now we can see through that red one there. And remember, if we want to jump back to the normal view, just hit this on here. That's how we change them. What if we want to change them while our animation is playing? Well, we can do that by binding the camera here. So I have my timeline down here. If I go to marker, you can see I've got a shortcut here, bind camera to markers. So I can click that and then we get a little camera marker here. And this says on frame 1, I want Blender to use this camera. So let's go to a different frame. Let's go to frame 21, and let's use the shortcut this time, which is Control B, and we need to have our mouse over here because that will do something different up here. So that is camera 2, and then on frame 41, we're going to do the same thing. Mouse down here, Control B. Now when we play our animation, you can see it's actually changing the cameras as we scrub through. And we can move these around as well. So if we want to move this here or even change the order, now we're changing the different order. And if we want to duplicate them, that's also possible as well. So if I want camera 2 to be here, and then I hit Shift D and duplicate it over here. And let's go camera 3, camera 2, camera 3, camera 2, I'm just duplicating. So now when we do this, you can see we scrub through and just flipping backwards and forwards. That's how we deal with our switching cameras. If we want to delete them, just select them all with the mouse over the little black strip here, and then hit the X key, delete the markers. So now they're all gone. But remember, that has changed our little settings here. So I'll show you one final way that we can set it. If we have no camera set, we can just hit the icon here, which is the eyedropper, and then just choose our camera. That is all the ways that you can set your camera. There's probably more that I don't know about, but there's many different ways to do the same thing. So we can actually change the settings of our camera from the viewport here if we have certain things enabled. So I'm going to select my camera here, and you can see when my mouse hovers over the end of the camera here, it's changing colors. So if I left click, I can drag that, and that's an alternate way of changing the zoom. Although I wouldn't suggest that you do it that way because you've got no real precise control over it. I find it's always better to use the settings here, so that way you can set it to be exactly what you want. And there's one other final thing that you can do, and that is you can change the focal point with these mouse manipulators if you have it enabled. So let's just go over to our viewport display, turn on our limits, and now when I hover over my mouse here, you can see it's gone green. If I left click, I can now drag and change that as well. The Blender camera can be manipulated any other way that an object inside 3D can. I've just got my little manipulator here. We can actually rotate it, and that will rotate the way that the camera is pointing. So we can go on any of the axes. We can translate it with our manipulators here on any of the axes. But if we scale it, it's only going to change the way it displays. It's not going to do anything to the way that it actually renders your image. Now, trying to position your camera like that can be a little bit tricky. So there's a few ways to make it easier. If we just go over to the View tab here, I've got too many tabs open, so you can't quite read that one. But under the View lock here, we can lock the camera to the view. So I'll actually do it in this one here. I'm gonna lock the camera to the view. And now when I rotate around, I'm just manipulating the viewport in the way that I want it to, and it's moving the camera in my scene. That's a good way to position it if you're just using a camera and not using a camera rig. And if you only needed to do a still render or a still shot, this would probably be a good way of doing it. But also get into the habit of turning these off straight away, because what you'll find is you'll go to move the camera again and you'll be like, oh, I didn't mean to move it. So just make sure that you get into the habit of turning it on and off. In addition to that, we also have fly and walk mode. So that is in our view up here. Actually, I'll enable it from our viewport here. We can go view down to navigation, and you can see we've got fly navigation and walk navigation. They work very similar, but one's going to walk along the ground where one can fly freely in the air. So I'll just choose walk for now. And you can see my mouse, when I move it around, it's going to position the way that it's looking. And if I hit the regular keys that you're used to, the W, S, A, D on your keyboard, you can actually walk it around. This is kind of like a first person shooter. And if you wanted to transport, you can push a spacebar or the middle mouse click, and that's going to teleport you to where the crosshairs are. Now you can scroll up to increase the speed that it's going to move, and scroll down to decrease the amount of speed that it's going to move. Now just escape that. Now fly mode works exactly the same way, except you're not constrained to the ground, so you can actually fly around. There's actually more keys that you can use. I'll just bring up the manual here. So if you go to the Blender manuals and just type in walk mode or fly mode, you'll get this page here, and it'll show you all the other buttons. So an easy way to find that is you just go to the help and go manual. That's going to bring it up here, and then just type in walk mode. There we go, walk, fly, navigation, and that is the menu there. Now, if you need to do any type of fancy movement with your camera, I would suggest using a camera rig. Now, I'll just show you how to insert one into your scene here, but then I'll have a separate video which explains in detail how to use it. We hit Shift A and we have the add-on enabled. We just go down to camera and we can choose a dolly rig, a crane rig, or a 2D camera. We'll be using these two this course. So just choose the crane rig, and now we can jump into pose mode for our armature here, and we can actually aim our camera exactly where we want, position it, and move them all around. So if you need to do anything fancy, I would suggest using a camera rig. It's going to make your life a lot easier. But as I said, that's going to be part of a separate video. Alrighty, I think that's everything you need to know about your cameras. Now let's have some fun playing around with them.